topics with Riveredge Nature Center. Every Wednesday at 10 a.m. we're going to bring on a different speaker from Riveredge, either one of our volunteers or one of our staff members, and have about a 20 to 30 minute presentation about something interesting that has to do with the natural world. And after we're done with the presentation, then we'll have some times, we'll mute everybody for the presentation, and then we'll unmute everybody afterwards, and we'll have an opportunity to ask our presenter, who's Thelma today, and I'll introduce Thelma, but ask her questions or have dialogue about the topic. Then when we're done with that, we'll have a chance, if anybody wants to hang around, and you certainly don't have to, but if you'd like to hang around to talk about anything, we'll just have an open opportunity to connect with each other, talk about our gardens or what we're seeing out in nature. So if you would like to hang around for that more of the social tea time at the end of this, you can. And if you don't want to, that's fine too. So without further ado, Thelma, do you want to wave at us? This is Thelma. She is, we're so happy to have her. She's our scientist in residence located at the Cedarburg School District. And so with that program, we have a scientist in residence, and the other one's on too. Rachel, do you want to wave for us? She's at the West Bend School District, and they partner with the teachers and administrators in those districts and support them in taking their curriculum outside in all different ways. Thelma has her PhD in entomology. Is that correct, Thelma?
Yes.
Yeah, so we're very excited because she knows everything about insects and bugs and all that fun stuff. And Thelma did, well, maybe not everything, but a lot. And Thelma did a wonderful lunch and learn this past winter for some of our volunteers and staff members on native bees. And it was very well received and people loved it. She had a huge crowd in the Octagon. So we thought, what a better way to kick off our tea and topics with Riveredge Nature Center virtually by asking Thelma to come on. So with that, we're going to mute everybody, and Thelma will let you lead us away, okay?
Let's see. Can everybody hear me? We're good? Okay. All right. Well, I am really excited to be kind of kicking this off today. And so we're going to be focusing on native bees. And as Jessica mentioned, I do have a background in entomology and insects. I love insects. And I've been doing a lot of work in more recent years with pollinators, because before I started working for Riveredge, I worked for the Xerces Society, which is the world's largest insect conservation organization. And they do a lot of work on how to protect pollinators and what pollinators are and what you can do to support them. And the reason I mention that is because a lot of the slides that I'm showing shortly are actually borrowed from them by permission from them to use them, because why recreate the wheel when we can keep using good material that's already there. So I am going to share my slides, and I'm going to hope that I can keep this within 20 to 30 minutes, because I'll talk about these insects for hours. And as you'll see, there's a lot of places and questions where we could really get in depth with it, but we'll try to keep this short, try to keep this kind of an overview, and then if you have questions at the end, we can go into depth a little bit more. Okay, let's see here. Give me 1 second. Okay. All right. Hopefully everybody can see that. Thumbs up on this one. Okay. All right. Well, I'm just going to start going here. So I am thinking about insects in a lot of different ways and contexts, and I like to show people wherever they are that we have pollinators everywhere. These are some pictures from the farm. So I live on a farm, and it's kind of a reminder to me that wherever you go, pollinators are there. That picture on the left is a flower that we are all going to be seeing very shortly, very soon, dandelions. And dandelions are one of the really important early spring flowers that a lot of pollinators will go and visit. And any of the flowers that are out blooming right now, start looking at them and see what kind of insects are visiting them, because the pollinators are going to be out there and the bees are going to be out there. I'm going to show you some pictures that I took 2 days ago during a Riveredge meeting, actually, where I was, so they're So today is just kind of thinking about where the pollinators are, what are you looking at, how can you find them, and what you can do to support them. So starting out with thinking about bees and pollinators in particular, the pollen is one of the ecological keystones. And obviously, I love insects and not tuned to them. I may be, but they're critically important to all of our ecosystems. About 85% of all flowers. And so we need to have actually the bees out there to reproduce so that we have those plant species continuing on. And just emphasizing like the importance of pollinators in other ways, the values that they provide to as humans, even though, you know, sometimes we don't, they're providing to us, but all that we eat, there's so much of the nutritious pieces of our diets, the colorful fruits and vegetables that we are asked to eat. We tell our kids to eat, you know, fruits and vegetables. It's important for us, nutrients and vitamins that are in there. And 35% of crops produced worldwide actually rely directly upon insects for pollination. And it's a huge industry, 18 to $27 billion of crops that are reliant upon pollinators. So just, there's so many connections that we have to pollinators, and sometimes we kind of forget how important they can be. And then there's also this really vital piece to the wildlife around us. Everything is connected in the world. Insects are no exception to this, of course. Like I said, so many of the different plant species need to have insects visit them for pollination to occur. And then those pollinators that are out there provide a lot of different things to other wildlife. Birds, for example, fruits and seeds are a major part of the diets of many different birds and many different mammals that are out in the landscape. So we want to have those plants reproducing because they're providing food for other wildlife. And another connection there is that insects in general, we just want to have those pollinators because they are directly our food sources for a lot of other wildlife as well. You think about birds. Birds are starting to nest right now, and what do they need to feed their young? They feed them insects, and a lot of times they will be pollinators. They will be bees and flies and things that are flying around. And there are so many different types of pollinators. And this is one where when I do bigger talks on this, we can go down the rabbit hole of so many different types of pollinators and getting in depth on all these different groups of insects that are actually doing this pollination service for us. Now, the bees are probably going to be the most familiar to us in terms of pollination, and it's rightly so. They are the queens, and well, not so much the kings, it's the queens in the bee world that do all of the work and are really the exceptional pollinators. And it's because if you ever look at a bee up close, they physically pick up and carry pollen. Their bodies are built for pollination. And the bees aren't doing it for typically the greater good of the plant species. They're doing it for selfish reasons because they actually need to collect that pollen and nectar to feed their young. But in the process of visiting all those flowers, they are providing pollination to those plants, those flowers. But there's more than just the bees. Now, there are a couple different bees here, and then there are a couple non-bees. Here, we've got this beautiful green bee, which a lot of people are not familiar with. They are fantastic looking, and we have a lot of them here. Then we have a lot of other bees that are more the typical, the yellow and black colored bee. We've got the big bumblebees that are out and about, and pretty soon we should be seeing some of them. I haven't seen any yet, but I've been looking. So those are just the big bee species. But the other pollinators, we've got flies, we've got beetles, we've got butterflies, we've got moths, just so many other creatures, wasps as well, that all provide pollination to flowers. But we're focusing mostly today on the native bees, which are these top three up in the top left. Now, when I ask people about bees, the first one, there are a couple different bees that people usually think of. You say, name a bee, and it's usually either the honeybee or a bumblebee that comes up. One of the things I like to point out, though, is that a honeybee is not native. They are not native to North America. They are introduced. Most of the ones we have here are the European honeybee. There are some other types of bees, honeybees as well, that we have here in the United States, but most of them are the European honeybee, and all of them are not native to here. So even though honeybees often come to mind when we think about pollinators and bees in particular. We really like to think about the native bees because they often don't get as much attention and we're not as aware of them. And they're hugely diverse. This is one of the coolest pictures that I think I've ever seen. These are some of the visuals to see how big and how little some of these native bees can be. How some of them can be absolutely massive, and then we can have these tiny, tiny bees that are less than 1/4 of an inch. So there's just a huge diversity in the size of these bees. If you've ever seen a big bumblebee queen, you can imagine like how big some of these bees can be. And a lot of them are so tiny that we don't even think of them as bees. And most of them are solitary. The honeybees, which do have bees, a lot of them live by themselves. Most of them cannot sting because they don't have stingers that are long enough to our skin. And they don't want to be aggressive because if a bee stings you or something happens to her, she's often creating a nest. So if something happens to her, her whole nest and all of her offspring are likely to die. So her goal in life is to protect her offspring and to find food and resources for them, not to attack us, not to sting us. And these native bees are just wonderful pollinators because a lot of different ways. There are many, many, many different species of bees. Here in Wisconsin alone, we've estimated somewhere around 300 to 400 different species of bees in Wisconsin. Now, if I asked you like how many bees can you think of, most people could think of like 1, 2, or 3, not hundreds of different species here. And they all have their own preferences as to what they like to eat. Just like us, we like to eat different things. The bees do too. And that's why it's important to have all these different flowers out there, because a lot of these bees have differences as to the colors of flowers, the types of flowers, the shapes of flowers, when they come out in the year. Those are all different important things and why bee diversity is important and flower diversity. Now, I'm gonna go through and just show a bunch of really cool looking photos that have been taken of bees, showing them up close and personal. Starting out with this one, and this is kind of one of the iconic bees that we have here in Wisconsin. It is the rusty-patched bumblebee. And this is an important bee, and I don't think it has not been found at Riveredge yet. Hopefully someday we'll be able to find it. But it has the dubious distinction of being the first bee in the continental United States to be listed on the endangered species list. And we have it here in Wisconsin. Wisconsin, Minnesota, Illinois are 3 of the states that really have populations of these. There are a lot of them found in the Milwaukee area and the Madison area. We'd love to find one at Riveredge, but it hasn't been found yet. But if we don't look, we'll never find it. Here's a picture of a cuckoo bee, just showing again that huge diversity in size. You can see this is a dime here, and you can see just how minute, how tiny that little bee really is next to a coin. And again, we don't often see bees this small because we're not looking for them. We just don't know that they're out in the landscape. This is one of the bees that I actually took a picture of last week when I was on one of our Riveredge calls. It was visiting one of the flowers. It was a sunny day, a tiny, tiny bee. I mean, the flower is maybe like 1 centimeter long, and that bee is way smaller than it. And it was flying around because it was one of the first warm days of the year. Right next to it were actually a bunch of honeybees as well, which just the honeybees were in size compared to this one. So this is a tiny bee, and actually I think this is the first time I've ever gotten a photo of this semi in focus because the bees are so small and it's really hard to get a picture of them. Here's another example. This is a longhorned bee. What I wanted to point out here is, look where the pollen is on this bee. So the bees are picking up pollen to feed their young. This bee is built with these huge hairs that essentially look like feathers because they have hairs on their hairs, and that's what picks up the pollen. It's called the pollen basket. And different bee species and different bee groups have the ability to pick up pollen in different parts of their body. So these longhorned bees pick up the pollens on their hind legs, the females do. Here's another bee. This is a carpenter mimic leafcutter bee. So leafcutter bees are going to go out and they cut circles into leaves, and they use those to build their nests for their young. This one just happens to look a lot like a carpenter bee, which are the big black bees, which are known to drill holes into wood. But these ones don't do that. They're actually looking for plant material and vegetation. And here's a picture of a bumblebee that's visiting a flower, just flying in the air. This is not one that we have here in Wisconsin, but just to give you an example of up close of what some of these look like. And you can see the tongue is hanging out of this bee as it's approaching the flower, and it's going to get ready to drink some nectar. All right, so now these are some really up close photos of bumblebees that we do have here in Wisconsin. And these photos are just really wonderful. They're taken by several labs at universities where they are able to stack photos. They take many, many different photos, they stack them together, and that's how we can get this resolution of these pictures of bees so up close. And you can see, if you could see this image on here, you can actually see the pollen grains on the hairs of this particular bee, which is just amazing to think about how much detail we could see, and the eyes and the antennae as well. So this is a half black bumblebee, or Bombus vagans. Again, these are all ones that we do have and can find here in Wisconsin. So just showing you some of the diversity. Now these are the males of this particular bee, and this is the queen. I'm hoping that we can see some of these pretty soon as it starts to warm up. This week is not the week for bees to be coming out though. It's just way, way too cold outside. This is another one. This is the brown-belted bumblebee, Bombus griseocolus, a queen up close. You can even see all of the different eyes on her. She's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 eyes in this picture. Here's another view from the side of what this beautiful bee looks like. Here's another one. This is the black and gold bumblebee, a female, Bombus auricomus. And these are just huge bees. Really, when you see them on landscape, it's hard to miss them because they're really big, just really, really beautiful. Here's another bee. This is not a bumblebee. This is a longhorned bee up close, and you can see all of the pollen grains across the entire body of this bee, including on its wings, not quite on its eyes, but on all of its legs and all over its body. Like I said, this is why bees are the pollinators of the animal world, because their bodies act like Velcro and pick up all that pollen as they move across from flower to flower. And that's what provides that really important pollination service. Here's another example of a longhorn bee, another one, Melissodes bimaculatus. This is another one that we have here. It's very common in Wisconsin and we can find in the summertime. And look at how long, this is where it gets its name from. It's got long horns, and those are the antennae. Now this happens to be one of my favorite bees, and this is one of them that I remember when I gave the talk at Riveredge this past winter, that a bunch of people came up to me and said, oh my goodness, I had no idea that this was a bee, and I've been killing them and squishing them, and I need to stop because it's one of our native bees. These are metallic green sweat bees. They are halictid bees. It's from the family Halictidae, and they look just like this. They are green, emerald green, and vibrant colored, and we have them here. I have not seen any yet this year, so maybe it's been a little bit too cold yet, but they will be coming out, especially in summertime. You will see them. I'm just going to show some other pictures of these. This is a male of that same bee. So in this case, the front end is green, but the abdomen is usually yellow and black striped. But still, you can still see that bright green color. And these are fairly big bees. They're usually about almost an inch long. So they are big enough for you to see very well with the naked eye. And this is just a top view if you wanted to take a look at like what exactly this bee is looking at, what you might be looking for. You'll see the green, you'll see the black and the yellow stripes. Like I said, they are out there and you can find them. This is what the male looks like. It's another view, just that vibrant bees. Now, this is the bee that most people think about when I say bees. It's the honeybee. This is a close-up of a honeybee. It's the yellow and black typical stereotypical bee that we're looking at. But what I wanted to point out on here is there is a parasite on this particular bee. There's actually two of them. There's one in the middle here, this reddish orange, and then there's one on the back. Whoop. And that is the varroa mite. That's one of the big problems that bees, particularly the honeybees, are facing right now. These varroa mites get in there and they cause bee populations to be mated because they're parasitizing the bees and removing all the nutrients from the bees' bodies, and they aren't able to make it through the winter as easily. Here's another close-up of the honeybee. If you didn't know this, the honeybee, if you look at the eye, has hairs coming out of its eyes. And that's one of the diagnostic things that you could look at if you ever get close enough to a honeybee, is that it actually has hairy eyes, which very few other bees have. All right. So one of the things I just wanted to talk about here when we talk about bees, talk about how important bees are, especially our native bees, but there are a lot of challenges that bees are facing, and this is why there's become such an interest in knowing more about pollinators, especially in about the last 10 years. Pollinator declines and some of the challenges that these bees are facing. And I want to mention them because there are things that you can do to help the pollinators out in your own backyard. But first, to be aware of what some of these challenges are is always a good place to start. So one of the big things that they're facing are habitat loss. So I mentioned how important flowers are and diversity is to supporting a diversity of different bees. Having habitat for bees is probably one of the most important pieces to being able to support them. Another challenge is pesticides, particularly insecticides, because insecticides are designed to kill insects, and when they're used on a broad landscape, whether it's in our urban landscapes, or on our lawns, or in gardens, or on cropland, they can all impact non-target organisms like our native bees. A third thing are the potential for diseases or non-native species that are starting to compete with the pollinators that we have. I had mentioned the varroa mite being one of those challenges bees are facing, and there are diseases and things that native bees can also face that get transferred from commercial bees to bee species. And then another challenge is climate change. Climate change impacts all different organisms, not just the bees. One of the ways I like to talk about the example is climate change can impact, when flowers are blooming, what plant species we have here. And there are really close relationships with the different types of bee species that we have with the plant species. And so as our plant communities can change, so too will and can the bee species that go along with them. So just a lot of different impacts that can happen. So these are just some of the challenges that the pollinators are facing. And another big challenge is that we know so little about many of our native bee species. Like I mentioned, I ask people, well, what bees we have, and they'll mention, maybe I know about a bumblebee or maybe I know about a honeybee, and we don't know a lot about those other bees. Well, that also happens in the scientific world where there just isn't a lot known about any of these bee species. We have hundreds of bee species here in Wisconsin, and there's a lot we don't know about most of them. There's hardly anything we know about a lot of them, actually. Where do they live? Where do they reproduce? What are their preferred plants that they visit? A lot of these bees, we just don't have enough information to be able to provide knowledge on how to even conserve them. So it's hard to make decisions and it's hard to protect them if we don't even know the basics about the life cycles of a lot of these species. And on top of that, there are a lot of pollinator declines that are happening that we're seeing now. This is not just pollinators, actually all insects in general. But when we talk about specifically pollinators, I think about 40% of pollinator species may be at risk of extinction. And again, putting that together with how we know so little about so many of these bee species, it becomes really challenging. There may be bees we've already lost here in Wisconsin. We just don't know because nobody was ever looking at them or studying them. But there are some particular groups of bees that have been studied a little bit more, and we understand a little bit more about them at least. One of these are the bumblebees. And bumblebees, because we know how many species there are in the United States, we've got 57 bumblebee species in Canada and the US, basically like North America. We've got a little bit more information and have a better idea of where we're at with trying to protect them and conserve them. And so one of the things we know about bumblebees is about a quarter of all the bumblebee species in North America are threatened, are either critically endangered, or very near threatened. And that's really challenging. A quarter of all of our bumblebee species are at risk of extinction. What can we do to protect that? What can we do to prevent that from getting worse, and that making sure that other species are not being threatened as well? And thinking about that, Wisconsin bumblebees in particular, this is something that I got really interested in, knowing that we have the rusty patch bumblebee, which is that endangered bee species here in Wisconsin. Like, what can we do? What can I do to help support these? Well, the bumblebees aren't a group of bees that I was really knowledgeable about, so I took it upon myself in the last several years to learn more about them. And I happen to live on a farm, and so I decided to start tracking the bumblebees on my farm. And I did this through a citizen science project done by the Wisconsin DNR called the Bumble Bee Brigade, which started 2 years ago. And you basically go out and you track the bumblebees that you find. And if you know how to identify them, that's great. If you don't, you take photos of them, you can submit them in, and they will help you with identification. But what I wanted to point out is I did this for 2 weeks. 1 week every year in 2018, and then 2019 I did it for a week. And I found 5 different bumblebee species on my farm in 1 week's time. And 5 bumblebee species is a quarter of the bumblebee species that we have here in Wisconsin. And I was shocked to find out that I had that much diversity in essentially my backyard, and I had no idea that it was there. So it challenges me to say, go out and look, because you really don't know what you got until you start looking. And we had some pretty cool species. So these are the ones that I found in my backyard. I've got the half-black bumblebee, brown-belted, the 2-spotted, the common bumblebee, and the yellow bumblebee. What I was really looking for was the rusty patch bumblebee, and I didn't find that, but I'm hoping maybe someday soon, maybe, I'll be able to find that too. And hopefully we can find that at some point too. Oh, all right. I'm going to wrap this up here and just talk a little bit about pollinator conservation. Now, we are in April, Earth Day is coming up, things are starting to grow. What can you do to help support these bees and pollinators? Well, there's a lot of things that you can do, and a big part of it is that habitat piece, thinking about what can you do to support them with the flower they need, the pollen, and the nectar. And providing blooms all the way through the season, from early, right now, all the way to the end of the season, at the end of fall, it becomes really important. These are examples of different places that I have worked across the country and putting in different habitat, and it looks different in all different places. And your backyard is gonna look different than somebody else's backyard and what you have blooming there. But the really important piece of this is the native plants, like incorporating in the native plants that these native pollinators use and have these really close relationships with. And native plants are also the ones that are going to be most adapted to where you live. So find plants that are from here in southeastern Wisconsin or your area of Wisconsin, wherever you live at. It becomes really, really important for supporting all these different bees and pollinators. And diversity becomes important too, because these bees have different ways of reproducing and nesting. And I'm just going to really briefly go over this. But there are ground nesting bees, there are tunnel nesting or above ground nesting bees where they nest in stems and hollows of different plant materials. And then we have the bumblebees that do cavity nesting, and they might use old rabbit holes or rabbit dens or burrows in the ground or tractor seats even, lots of different places where they'll nest. And the ground nesting bees, they burrow tunnels in the ground. I wanted to mention that because we will start seeing some of these bees coming up to the surface now that it's starting to warm up in the springtime. I was watching a bee come up out of the ground. So they are starting to emerge, and they will be emerging, all different species all throughout the year. The tunnel nesting bees, they use plant material and stems or sometimes holes in old dead trees to make their nests in. Just like you can see here, these ones have been cut in half so you can see where the pupae and the larvae are developing in them. But they use those old stems from your plants. So if you have plants and you're clearing out your gardens right now, I encourage you to cut your plants off, 6 to 8 inches high so that these tunnel nesting and stem nesting actually use them, because they are starting to come out now and they will use them. I have seen bees come to them after I cut the plants off in April, and immediately the bees will start showing up and start looking to find a place to create their nests. And that's happening, like I said, right now as it starts to warm up in our backyards. The bumblebees are starting to come out too. We are going to be seeing really shortly. Keep your eye out for them. If you find bumblebees, track them, get a picture of them, put them up on the Wisconsin Bumble Bee Brigade site, because it's a great resource to be able to understand where all these different bumblebee species are in Wisconsin. And don't kill queen bumblebees in the spring. The queens are the only ones that overwinter, and it's really important for them to get out, find food sources, and start their whole new colony up. The one queen is responsible for making that whole nest up, and the springtime is the most important time for her to be able to really build up her nests. And again, this importance of creating habitat supports so much more than just the bees. We've got all these birds that are starting to nest now as well, and almost all birds feed insects to their young because they need to have that really good food source. And so you're going to see a lot of, pay attention to the birds that are out and about right now. They're going to be out collecting insects as well to feed their young in a few weeks. And I already mentioned this, we got 22 bumblebee species in Wisconsin. See how many you can find if you go out and about and start looking for them. You might be surprised to see what's actually in your backyard. And this is the picture of the rusty patch bumblebee. This was taken right here in, and I'm gonna close with a couple pictures of the rusty patch. It's a beautiful bee. It's only an inch, not even that. And I'm going to finish this up because of rusty patch has been found right up area likelihood to be found because area. I zoomed in on the area of Riveredge is in here. Patch town.
I think we lost Thelma for a moment, so we'll give her a moment to get signed back in and we'll carry on.
In the meantime,
right.
if anybody has questions for Thelma, we'll take those as well. If you don't want to try to talk, you can also open up your chat at the bottom. So if you move your mouse around and at the very bottom of your screen, there should be a box that says chat, and you click on that and the chat will come up, and whatever you type in there will be sent to everybody on this Zoom. So if you have questions, you can type them in there. And I think while we're waiting for Thelma, actually we do have exciting news, and that is that the rusty patch bumblebee has been found at Riveredge. So just last year, I think Matt, you're on. Do you have any information about that you can share of when it was found and how it was found? And our
yeah, it was actually found by a UW Milwaukee field class in entomology. Can everyone hear me all right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And I'm sitting in front of rusty patch bumblebee food. I'm not sure if Thelma said this, but the one unique thing about rusty patch is it has a little tongue, and it's somewhat nectar limited by the structure of flowers. So you can have a whole prairie in bloom, but some of those flowers, the bee has to work a lot harder to get nectar from. So we have a custom seed mix, and I'll show you a few of the seeds here. We're getting ready to seed these species out on the landscape this spring. We've got a couple sites that we removed invasive species, which has given us an opportunity to replace that vegetation with more relevant species for this insect. So we're really looking forward to that. And if you're curious at all about good species for these insects, we have a list that we can share, but I think Thelma can probably also echo some resources that are out there through, I think, the Fish and Wildlife Service that has the rusty patch bumblebee listed, has a whole list of good plants to have specific to that insect.
And Thelma, we have you back. We lost you for a
Yes.
moment. Good old country internet. We were just sharing that, and Matt was providing us information, is that we did find the rusty patch bumblebee at Riveredge last year. A group from UW Milwaukee did that. And we do have a question on, can you go over a little bit about identifying the features of the rusty patch in specifically?
Yeah, so identification of bumblebees is not easy. Tell you that now. I have been, identifying insects my whole life, and bumblebees have been one that has been pretty challenging. And so there are specific things that can help them, but what I usually tell people to do is I actually have a sheet here of the bumblebees of Wisconsin. And this is off the site. They have these really nice charts of all these that are found in Wisconsin. And then you can go on there and look and see what the differences are. It's hard to say specific features of the rusty patch because there are other species that people get them confused with very quickly. I will say that the rusty patch is not a big bumblebee. So people are sometimes thinking, oh, this will be like a 1 to 2 inch bee. I'm like, no, no, no. These are like 3/4 inch. They're actually very small, much smaller than I ever thought they would be. But they're easily confused with others. And a lot of the pictures that people have sent me are not the rusty patch. So that's kind of my FYI. Take a photo, send it to somebody else, and get it confirmed before you think it's the rusty patch. And just because it has a brown patch on it does not make it the rusty patch bumblebee. There are lots of other bumblebees that we have here that do have a brown patch on their back.
That's great. Thanks, Thelma. Going off of what Matt, what you were saying about the seed mix, do you know, I don't believe we don't currently have native plants for sale right now, but we always do every year. So there was a question about that. So there's definitely an opportunity to come to Riveredge as soon as we reopen and get some very reasonably priced native plants on our plant sale that goes on all summer long on our porch. It's really a great place to get those. And Matt, I'm not sure about seed mixes. We do have seeds in our nature store. I don't know if we have one specifically though for the rusty patch bumblebee. I don't believe so.
We have a really good relationship with a native plant nursery and can actually generate some of these similar custom seed mixes for you if you're interested. You can just email me at msmith@riveredge.us. I'm also on the staff list on the website with some of your questions, and I'd be happy to answer that and put you in touch with some of these nursery ecologists that specialize in customizing mixes for new prairies and existing ones that are impoverished with species.
Thelma, do you know when you took those pictures of the bees, there's a question, is using a cell phone, is that appropriate if you want to participate in the Bumblebee Brigade?
Yes. A lot of the photos that I have taken of bumblebees for the Bumblebee Brigade have been on my cell phone because I have that camera with me all the time. And I have identified bumblebee species with a fairly blurry picture taken from a cell phone. What I would encourage is if you're using your cell phone is take many pictures because the determining features for different species are different things and you may not know what they are, but if you send them to somebody who does, I can take a look at it and say, okay, I can see the abdomen stripes or the number of yellow stripes on there on this photo. I can't see it on this photo, but then there's a third photo that does tell me it. So yes, a cell phone absolutely does work. I just encourage you, don't take just one photo, take many. And my neighbor who had the rusty patch, he sent me a very blurry photo of his rusty patch, but he took it at just the right angle that we could positively identify it. So hopefully that'll help you out. You don't have to have a fancy camera to be able to do that.
That's great. Thanks, Thelma. And I just want to let everybody know that Natalie put up the link to that Bumblebee Brigade field guide in the chat right there. So you should be able to just copy and paste that into your browser. But we can also post that as well. And then Matt has his email address in there. Do you know, Thelma, any about specifically with the rusty patch? You know, folks are asking questions about what to plant and things like that. Do you have any like suggestions of your top 3 native plants that you would recommend?
I don't know specifically for the rusty patch. They're kind of a generalist, so there's a lot of different plants that they will visit. I think, like Matt said, they tend to have shorter tongues, so they're not ones that are going to be using flowers with like really long, like the corolla or the shapes on them, like the longhorn bees can use. They tend to be with more shallow nectarid plants, as we call it. But that's where, again, it's not just the rusty patch. It's having a diversity of native wildflowers becomes really important because you are going to have longhorn bees. You are going to have bees with shorter tongues. And you want to just have all different types of flowers that are blooming all throughout the season to be able to support a lot of that diversity.
Great. Ed asked if you plant native plants would it also in your yard, would it also be beneficial to like your fruit trees and your vegetable gardens, those type of things? Can you maybe expand on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there's a lot of native cherries and apples and things like that that the pollinators are using as well. And a lot of those also have benefits to us because we get to eat them also. So again, that's just part of that diversity piece as well. Yeah, if you've got vegetables and fruit garden, you can, plant away. I was thinking in vegetable gardens in particular, if you have a lot of herbs going and you don't get to use them all like I do, you can just let some of them go to bloom. Things like cilantro and just a lot of the herbs, basil even, and you'll find a lot of the pollinators actually will start to come visit them. So even though that's not a native that you've intentionally planted for the pollinators, it can still provide some blooms just by kind of letting things go a little bit.
That's great. Oh, we have some other great questions here. What about nocturnal bees? Do we have nocturnal bees in Wisconsin?
Probably. These are kind of one of those areas where I think people haven't really looked at it as much. I mean, we kind of assume like flowers going to go to sleep at night, and so probably the bees do too, but I would never assume that. We know that there are pollinators like the moths that are definitely out at night. And I don't know about the bees. And I guess I would never say no, because in the insect world, there's an exception to everything. So even though I don't know, I'm sure probably is somewhere. I know that bumblebees will be up really early in the morning. And another thing is if you have squash that you plant, one of the best pollinators for squash are squash bees, and they are only out at sunset, like really, really early in the morning. When I would do research on them, I would never get out early enough to actually see the squash bees in action. So, there are different times of the day when these are all active. They all have their personal preferences. Some are night owls, some are early morning risers.
That's excellent. All right, can you go over the egg laying and plant stems again, just to help us better understand that? Do they lay their eggs in fall or just in spring? Because you mentioned cutting off those stems now. So can you just maybe help us understand that a bit more?
Yeah, so this goes along again with that there's a huge diversity of different bees that are out there, hundreds of species that we have right here in Wisconsin. And so some of them will come out now and will work on making their nests, and they'll use the stems of plants, may start doing it right now. So if you buy or have any of those bee nesting boxes or tubes or stems or anything like that, I know you can buy those at like garden stores and things like that, and you start watching them, bees starting to visit them early in the spring. But then you can also see that happening all throughout the season, because different will come out in June, different species will come out in July. There may even be species coming out in September that will then start making their nests. So there isn't just a one particular time of the year. There are different species that are doing it all throughout the year. Now, there may be ones now that come out for a couple of weeks and do their nests, and then they go away, and we won't see them again until next year at the same time. And then there are other ones that will come out in July. They will make their nests, and then we won't see them again until next year in July. So again, it really varies, and this is where our lack of knowledge and studies of a lot of these different species, we just don't have a complete picture about when all of them are emerging and active. But I do know that I've seen some of these stem nesting bees out and about already this year, just with that 1 or 2 days that we had where it was super warm out.
So Thelma, are you still there? Okay.
I am. Yep.
You froze on my end, but I'm out here in country internet land too. So, when you say they're coming out, do they overwinter underground and they're coming out to make those nests and lay their eggs now, or the ones that you're speaking of in the spring?
Yeah. So what they do, this is for the ground nesting and the stem nesting bees. So just to give you an idea here, about 70% of the bees are ground nesters, where they actually make their nest underground, and about 30% are the stem nesters. But all of them lay their eggs and have their young in either in the ground nest or in their stem nests. And then the adults die, and it's the pupa that overwinter and then emerge in either the springtime or the summertime. And then those adults come out, they reproduce, they lay their eggs, they find more pollen and nectar to create new nests for their young for next year, and then they go away and die. So it's like an annual cycle that happens. So the bees that you're seeing come out now a lot of times are newly emerged ones, not ones that have overwintered.
Great. Oh, here's a good question. If most bees return to their nests at night, I'm wondering if we could encourage farmers to spray at night. It is easier to do with GPS equipment to make evening spraying possible. Is this encouraged? So would that be beneficial if when farmers or agriculture are spraying, if they do it at night, would that be better for our bees?
It could be, yeah, because the bees are more active during the daytime. They're coming back at the net. It kind of varies, because at the same time, if they're coming back to the nest, and what if the nests are in the cropland? So a lot of times the cropland is where there's actually some soil. They might be able to, they might be making their nests in these open kind of soil areas. So there isn't an exact answer for this. It kind of really depends on the situation of what crop you're growing, what do you actually need pollinators to it or not. And then there are also issues of what are you spraying for? Are you spraying for insects? Or are you spraying for weeds? So sometimes, yeah, it's not as cut and dry as just saying just spray at night, unfortunately.
I can add something just more logistically. A lot of times you'll get an inversion or fog at night, and herbicides require a certain amount of dry time. And so whenever there's dew on the grass, often as like a certified applicator for agricultural companies and restoration companies, I wouldn't actually be spraying until much later in the day because of the percentage of water on leaves in the field. It just would dilute the herbicide on the target plants. That's all.
Yep, that's a good point too. Great. I mean, if does anybody else have any questions or comments for Thelma? You can always unmute yourself too. You can go ahead and unmute if you'd like to talk as well. That's fine. Well, that was wonderful, Thelma. Thank you so much.
What, can I ask one question?
Oh, of course, Hattie. Yes.
What does Thelma think about the orchard bees that you can buy from bee companies?
Yeah. So you can buy bees and bring them in. So you can do orchard bees. Some people buy bumblebees and move them around. So on a pollination level, it could work really well because you're bringing in the bees for your orchard and you get really great pollination because you got that particular species that is really good at it. There are some challenges to this, and that comes kind of along the same lines of having honeybees that get moved across the country for pollination. So anytime we start moving bees around, and a lot of these bees will be moved across the country because the orchard bees come from usually the like Pacific Northwest area, there's that potential to start moving diseases and parasites and other issues that the bees have on them or associated with them to a new part of the country. And so we could potentially be introducing or exposing our native bees here to some. Now, if there are no issues with those bees that you bring in, it could be okay, but we don't always know. And this is an issue that's come in with, for example, and this is a different crop, but tomatoes that are grown inside, they often bring in bumblebees to do the pollination because the bumblebees help with improving the set for tomatoes that are grown inside. And there's been bigger and bigger issues showing that there are fungal diseases and things that these bumblebees are introducing to our native bees or native bumblebees. And I don't want that same thing to happen with those same bees that you mentioned. So it's just something to think about, that anytime we're moving insects across the country, which happens all the time with the honeybees, is that idea of transfers of diseases. I mean, we think about what we're all doing right now with being at home trying to prevent a disease from being spread. It's the same thing that happens with insects as they move across the country, that pathogens can be moved very, very, very quickly.
Good answer.
Good question, Hattie. Yeah, go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, a question. Oftentimes I see like the ground nesting bees in areas where it's like a man-made structure like berms or, like some loose ground or perimeter of farm fields and that sort of thing. And I'm just wondering, if you were to make a man-made mound structure, what kind of soil would you use? Or maybe I'm wondering with a lot of the ash trees and the stumps being ground, if that would be good habitat for the ground nesting bees. So I'm just wondering, if you were to make let's say a man-made structure to encourage the nesting, what kind of soil and conditions would you want?
Yeah, good question. So one of the key things there is having exposed soil altogether, like not vegetation on it, because like you said, that's often where you see these ground nesting bees. They're along the edges of agricultural land, or they might be on the edge of a slope where there isn't as much vegetation and you can actually see the ground. And that's what those particular bees are often looking like. I have seen the ground nesting bees in the middle of a driveway before, because that was the only area where it was not vegetated. Like there was grass and sod growing right up to the edge of the driveway, and they somehow managed to make their nests in the dirt of the driveway. Kind of amazing, because it was pretty compacted, but that was their habitat area. So in creating spaces, I guess it would just say, keep it open. They usually like kind of very sandy, silty soil that's not going to be waterlogged, that drains well. That's why they like being on slopes typically. You're not going to have water sitting into it. Vegetation off becomes really important. Last summer I was working in a garden and they had raised beds, and that's where I saw all of the ground bees nesting. They were on those hills where water would run off, and they were making their nests in those hills. And that was just, regular ground, but like I said, there was no vegetation other than the crops that we had growing on it. I've never had any luck actually getting the ground nesting bees to nest where I want them to when I leave the ground open. There might be something else involved with what they prefer, but I haven't quite figured out what that is. But I like that idea of thinking about the ash trees too and open spaces, and maybe that's the opportunity to create new habitat areas for these bees.
Has anybody had any use or luck with those gimmicks or houses, those bamboo groups that they sell in garden supply stores that you hang in trees? You know what I mean?
Oh yeah.
They're just
yeah.
They're just something to give your grandmother for Christmas, right?
Yeah. They do work. The bees will use them if you put them out early enough. But there are some challenges to this, and this is the other concern that I have about all these popular nests that are out, is that you can't leave them out and just let them go year after year after year and have the bees continually using them, because there is that possibility again of pathogens and building up inside of those nests. Because if you think about it in the natural world, if they're using stems of plants that are out in the landscape, those plants break down after a year or two. Right? I mean, that's just the natural cycle. At some point, those stems are going to be too far gone and the bees won't use them anymore. And so then the bees would choose something that would be better. When we start making these artificial nests, they may be out there longer than what we want. Some of them are made out of plastic. Some of them are made out of very protected wood. So I hope not treated wood even. But the bees are continually in there. And unless you clean them regularly, there is that chance that you're creating a worse environment for the bees to actually be in. And I base this off of, I actually did research on this at Iowa State University. I did a big research project on nests, and I kind of deemed that it's just better to use natural materials. So if you have some plant materials in your yard right now that you're cleaning up, take those bundles of the stems, and I think of mints in particular are really great ones. So if you have like bee balm, you can take those stems, bundle it up, put a rubber band, put it out in some corner of your yard where you want to have the bees using it as a nesting block. Because after a year or two, those stems will break down, and that's just the natural cycle, and then the bees won't be able to use them. And I always encourage actually going out and buying them. Even though the bought ones are really cool looking and really neat, most people want to manage it in a way I think that would be the safest for the bees. I know how it is. You just put it out and you forget about it for like 5 years, and that's the reality of most of us anyway.
Thank you.
Good question. Any other questions or comments? All right. Well, at Riveredge, we have Zooms. We do the sign language version of clapping where we go like this. So thank you, Thelma, very much for this presentation. We're very excited to have you. And of course, anyone online, if you have follow-up questions, you know, Thelma's email is also on the Riveredge staff webpage. So I'm sure you can send her a question and she'd be happy to answer it, or any to us as well. That being said, we also have some other staff members on, like Sunny and Mary and all kinds of other folks, that if anybody has any kind of nature questions or phenology questions or wants to share what they've been seeing outside of our bees, we certainly can open up the mics and, you know, talk about that as well. It's really cold right now. I was thinking that maybe we should retap the maple trees, but probably not. I saw them running by me again. Probably wouldn't be the best bet for the maple trees, but hoping it's going to warm up. So is anybody seeing anything out there we want to talk about?
Well, I had lots of fun on Easter Sunday. I'd been watching some of the birds, especially the goldfinch, who have been quite green. And then suddenly on Easter Sunday, here was this bright yellow and black goldfinch. And it was like, ah, a flying Easter egg. It was great to see. It seemed like they changed overnight, but I guess it probably had been a week or more.
That's
So a
wonderful.
whole lot
Mary, what have we been?
Yep.
Oh,
Yeah,
go ahead.
I was just about to add that brown thrashers are in. A couple people have reported those, along with a lot of the ruby-crowned kinglets. So keep your eyes for big and small birds that have just come back within the last couple of days.
Excellent. And Sunny, what frogs have you been hearing? Sunny is our resident amphibian and lover, and always does our frog surveys at Riveredge every year.
Yep. With the cold weather, the frogs have definitely gone silent. I did hear chorus frogs again and wood frogs over the weekend. But yeah, nothing this week. So look for their return. They should be singing again this weekend as it warms up. Unless anyone else, especially people who live further south in Wisconsin, have you guys heard any this week? No.
Yeah, they've gone quiet at our house too. So I was just at the vernal pond last week, and it was, you know, just wonderful and loud. And Renee, I know you were there too. Got some of those sounds, but I have a feeling it's pretty quiet again. Great. Any other observations or things you'd like to share, or questions in general? Oh, go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, it's a rabbit question. I assume there must be a rabbit expert in the group here. Hey, so I was planting my garden a week ago, dug up, there was 3 little bunnies in the hole. Must have been like 2 days old. I'm not sure. Their eyes were still closed. Anyhow, I didn't want them in my fenced area, moved them outside my fence, put them in a hole, just hoping nature would take its course for the better. The mother rabbit did return. I saw the mother rabbit protecting the bunnies from 2 crows. It was kind of an interesting interaction to see that. But I'm just wondering, I'd like to move the little bunnies at some point because they will squeeze through my wire fencing. So wondering when a safe time to move them to a far enough distance, maybe to the park down the street or something like that. So I'm wondering when would be a good time to transport the little bunnies where they can fend for themselves.
A good question. Mary, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, about to suggest make sure, first of all, that they have fur. They're, you know, when they're first born, they're born naked, basically. And when their eyes are open and they have fur, then it might be a safer time to move them. One never knows. As soon as they are able to, they will scatter like the wind. You know, they're not going to stay in the nest. So you can move them, but they won't stay put for the adult to come back necessarily. So, you know, if you move them after they have got a fair chance of making it on their own, would probably be the best move.
You'll know because they'll be gone.
That's right.
Good luck with that, Tom. That's a good question. Thanks for taking care of the bunnies. Ed, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was going to observe. I just posted a link in the chat section of a recent plant phenology blog. One of our volunteers, Pat Fairchild, is sending us her phenology recordings, and then we're posting them on the blog. So feel free to go to the chat and click on that and check out what's blooming, what's flowering, what's budding, what's got leaves, and compare with what you have in your yard.
Yeah, I was amazed that we have that many things blooming so far at Riveredge, or just about to bloom too. And then Ed, if they're also, for some reason, if they're struggling with, if everybody's struggling with finding that link in the chat, if you just go to the Riveredge website, it's on the front page. Is there a link at the bottom to it?
For this blog in particular?
Yeah.
There isn't presently right now.
Okay.
But you can just copy and paste that link and go to that address. Otherwise, just click on our blog from our navigation on the top menu, and it'll be right in there.
Great. Wonderful. John?
There's a quick question. There was one in the chat area as well. To avoid areas of ground nesting bees, when you're gardening, you tend to, do they swarm? They seem to attack, some of the species seem to attack, or are those more the wasp type of bees?
Oh, yeah. So the bees typically don't attack. Even the ground nesting bees, a lot of them don't have the physical capabilities to sting at all, like to even pierce our skin. So it's not really a risk to us. The ones that attack are going to be the wasps.
Okay.
So those are like the yellow jackets, for example. Yeah, and the other thing I'd like to point out is that those ground nesting bees, while they sometimes, I know like end of May is often when and people are like, oh my goodness, I've got lots of these bees nesting behind my house and they're coming out of the ground like crazy. They often only do that for about 1 week, and then they are gone because 1 week they're out and they make their nest and then they go back underground for an entire year and you don't see them. So I just say, like, leave them be for that week or so that they seem to be really crazy, because then seriously the next week you're going to completely forget they're even there because they're not even active anymore. But yeah, they're not aggressive. Most of them are very solitary. They don't want to attack anything. They work on their own. They're solitary creatures. They just don't have the capacity to be able to work together like the yellow jackets and those ground nesting wasps do. Really aggressive.
Thanks.
I was going to add, I did a big planting on a hillside on North Lake in Waukesha, and there were thousands of those ground nesting bees. And I was really worried because we had to put in, I think, like 7,000 plants, and I'm like, we're going to get stung today. Not a single one of us got stung, and we were putting in little plugs on the whole hillside. So I can attest that at least that one species was kind of benign to stinging.
That's a great question. Deb, thanks for asking it. And John, thanks for noticing it in the chat. I missed that one, so thank you. Great. Oh, it's so fun to see so many of you here today. Any other last comments, observations, questions for the group?
Want to take the opportunity to wish Sue Carlman a happy birthday that's coming up the end of this week. We don't get a chance to see each other that often, and nice to have the chance to say it in person.
That's wonderful. Happy birthday, Sue. Thank you, Mary. That's great. It's good to see you this morning. Wonderful.
I actually have a question.
Yeah, Julie.
About sandhill cranes. There's a breeding pair of cranes that has returned again. According to the residents in my building, they return every year. There's a park nearby where they nest. And last year they had a young one with them. They don't yet this year. I'm assuming they're nesting. But we did have some folks downstairs who were putting bread out on the lawn for them. And I know that's not the best. So I'm wondering, like, what can we put out? What can I suggest to them if they want to put out food for the cranes? Any ideas?
natural things are best. So, you know, if they have corn or something on that order would be much better than putting out bread and things that have preservatives and, you know, all kinds of artificial stuff in it. It'd be better to give them grain of some sort. You know, even your bird seed would be better. You know, the commercial bird seed would be better than putting out bakery, you know, that you get from the store.
And I think Cassie reminded us too that feeding the wildlife is pretty frowned upon, besides putting out bird food, like Mary was saying, you know, for the birds in general. So Julie, you may want to just remind them of that as well.
Yeah. There's one lady in particular, she actually just moved to Colorado, but she's 92 and she just loves the birds and when they come in, and so she wants to feed them something. So it's like, what can I tell them? You know, that's going to be better, but yeah, I'll remind them.
That's a good question. Thank you for asking on behalf of all of them. Wonderful. Any last comments or?
I can add one more comment to the protection of like wood boring bees. And, you know, there's a lot of talk about sticks and as habitat, but even logs, like having a decayed log or a standing dead snag in your yard, although like your neighbors might hate it, it's actually a really valuable habitat. For those, we have, my wife is really into terrariums, and we have one kind of semi-rotten log that we put moss on. And for the past 3 years, there have been things coming out of that log, insects coming out of that log over the course of 3 years. It's just this mind-boggling. So there's, you know, even maintaining that in your landscape is a real asset for those insect communities.
Or have a cedar-sided house.
That too.
Definitely.
They love it.
Yep, neat and tidy yards aren't exactly the you know, most happy of places for our native insects and pollinators. So, but I always want to say we live in the country, so it's not that big of a deal. But we do not have a neat and tidy yard as far as anything, and we have lots of dead trees and logs and all of that, and lots of dandelions. And I always want to put a sign up. Maybe this is the year I'll finally do it at the end of our driveway, saying "Now entering Pollinator Preserve," just to let people know that there's a benefit to some of that. So great.
Question. I guess I'm making this drag on. I apologize. Does anyone know anything as far as legality regarding planting native species in your, like, say, city yard habitat? Is there any legal requirement to have grass, sod, versus native plants that would be maybe considered weeds? And how do you go about that if anyone's aware of these requirements?
It's all your local zoning issues. Every municipality has something about how tall your plantings in your yard can be. Some of them don't want you to have grass more than 6 inches. So the thing to do is to put a fence around it and make it look like it's a garden, which is what we've all started to do. And even some places don't want it in the front yard. So you just have to check with the local ordinances. Over the years, we've had lots of different encounters, and Riveredge has been brought into several arguments. So just check. And also make sure your neighbors understand what you're doing, because the only way these get enforced is when a neighbor complains.
Yeah, I had a neighbor offer to have her landscaping guy cut down my weeds, my raspberries.
Yeah, you need to explain. I've also had neighbors spray the dandelions in my yard. Yeah, exactly.
I worked with a neighbor who was cutting out a lot of dead ash trees, and we got him to plant hazelnuts and some elderberries, like closer to the river, and some actual native plants, so that it can work out, but it does take time in that relationship building.
Good job, Sonny.
He still puts out corn for the ducks, though. Oh well.
Lose some, lose some.
That's great.
I do
Thanks. I
also
think
have
that
a
was
question.
Judy. Thank you.
Oh, yep,
Following
John.
Ed. I just moved to a house this last fall, and it's the first time I've ever been on a septic system, and it's a mound septic. Is there any good way to plant on the mound? Would that be a good prairie? Or should that not be done?
So I'm not a septic expert, but I have a mound, and I've lived in the country a long time. And I think the biggest thing is, you can mow them. I think you can plant on them. I mean, the native plants would have very deep roots, but I don't think that would affect the mound. Mary, you're shaking your head. Do you know anything more detailed about that? Oh, you're on mute.
So yeah, they do suggest prairie plants for mound systems. Again, depends on where the mound is in your yard, and again, those ordinances about how high things can be and all that kind of thing. But sure, I would put in prairie plants and make it very attractive and interesting, and who knows how many pollinators you might get, and then of course you get the birds that come with the pollinators. So yeah, I would go for it. Find things that you like, that are pretty, and put that in on your mound. You just can't have like deciduous trees of any sort, that have deeper roots.
Maybe put a fence around it, John, if you have curious neighbors.
Not a problem. The backyard is wide open, and I butt up against the river. My property's on Milwaukee River, so.
Nice. Perfect.
Thank you.
Cool. Yeah. Well, we'll meet again next week at 10 o'clock. I don't know, Natalie, if we have a topic quite yet. We're pulling this together pretty quick, but we have lots of great options. So do we have anybody finalized for next week yet, Natalie?
To be determined. Will be announced soon.
All right, will be announced soon, and we'll try to get a schedule up as we get people confirmed. So you'll be able to see week by week which ones you'd like to participate in. And please share it with others. And we just love seeing you all. It's a great opportunity to connect. So thanks for being part of Riveredge. You all, yes, we do at the end of our Riveredge things too. We clap for everybody. So thank you very much. We will see you next week. Goodbye.
So long.